session. I'm very delighted actually that our first session created so many interesting debates already. I heard around coffee break, and I hope that our second session before our lunch break will add a lot of new interesting thought-provoking ideas. As we heard actually from our president and Mr. Vice President too, but there is a lot of questions today up within not only Europe but in the entire Western world. And there are, of course, the reasons why the questions are up. 2016 has been quite an interesting breaking point in many ways on both sides of a pond. And it's going to be quite crucial actually for us to analyzing a current situation, what kind of direction we take both here in Europe in terms of transatlantic relations, but also commonly, as we still understand that the West matters. Not only Europe matters, but the West matters. And those challenges we will talk later on today with Federica Mogherini and our foreign minister, and tomorrow about defense and other issues. We see that the number of growing challenges is just a matter of real concern. And how do we, in better way, tackle these concerns from south to east, and also what is going on, for instance, at the moment on Korean Peninsula. So to try to answer to these questions and also be in a lively debate with you, I invited a great panel to here to Tallinn. But before I turn to panelists, we actually prepared one short video discussion for our conference. Just 1 month ago, we hosted here in Tallinn Chairman of Foreign Relations Committee of House of Representatives of the United States, Mr. Ed ROYCE. He is a distinguished member of House of Representatives, and since 2013 he has been the chairman of House Foreign Affairs Committee. Having years of experience in Congress and in the making of foreign policy, Royce has a high level of experience in American politics and in US foreign policy. And as I said just a month ago, on August 8th, we had an opportunity to talk to him. So please, let's watch the short video discussion with him. Mr. Royce, it's my great pleasure to welcome you in Tallinn, and it's very good to have you with us today to discuss transatlantic relations. To be honest, we have experienced a few bumps in the road recently when it comes to EU-US relations. At the same time, we know how vital actually we are to each other in order to in maintaining the integrity of the free Western world, and especially at the times when the growing number of challenges are there to challenge our way of life. What is your take on current EU-US relations, and how important is the European Union for the United States today as a partner in global affairs?
I think it's just as important as it has been to the United States over the last 30 years, over the last 50 years. The reality is that for us, having Europe unified, having it whole and having it free and having Europe at peace has been the cornerstone of our our focus on foreign policy towards Europe, and to do this in a collaborative way with Europe. And you're right, we have had setbacks. One of those setbacks, after Congress acted and gave to the executive branch the authority to do a transatlantic as well as a Pacific trade agreement, this was not followed up on by the executive branch. As a matter of fact, both political parties' candidates said they were not going to use this to move forward. So in this respect, to talk about trade for a minute, we are trying to push an agreement forward so that we can get back on track with respect to a trade agreement with high standards with Europe. And Estonia would be a big part of this because Estonia chairs the EU this year, but also because it is a country that stands for liberalized trade, that takes a position on transparency, on trying to move forward with systems which are forward-leaning in terms of what it's going to mean for good governance. And so we are very enthusiastic in terms of trying to get that back on track. And recently we passed our covered agreement on insurance and reinsurance with Europe, which I think is a good expression of where Congress stands, and that is now moving forward. I would say on security, equally, as you know, we take a strong position in terms of Article 5 in the Congress, and also with respect to the issue of Russia's noncompliance with international norms. I was the author, I'm the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, of the recent legislation to put sanctions on Russia. That passed 419 to 3 in the House, 97 to 2 in the Senate. So you have some sense of the bipartisan support that the United States has with respect to the security arrangement with Europe.
Actually, this leads to my next question.
Yes.
During the last 3 years, actually, the United States and the European Union have shown strong unity in managing an increasingly assertive Russia. One of the areas, actually, you are very actively involved in Congress is the fight against propaganda and disinformation. Could you please elaborate a little bit? What is the United States planning to do in this field, and what could we do more together?
And let's talk about, for a minute, what worked in the past. I was in Eastern Europe in 1985 on an exchange program, and I saw the effectiveness then of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And this is to be contrasted with our ability today to have a free surrogate radio and a television service that's effective in countering RT television or Sputnik or, you know, some of the organs of propaganda and social media that are used in Russia. What we want is information that is free and reliable, but tells the truth about what is happening in the capitals of all of Europe, and tells on a daily basis the stories of the struggle to get it right in terms of governance. We share with Europe this commonality on individual rights and on human rights, and we think it's important to have a focus on this. And so I have passed legislation now that reforms our broadcasting and changes our mission back to what it was with respect to providing a platform to get information out about what's actually going on, and do this with truthful, objective news, with stringers, reporters, and to have a way to measure the success of this. And so I think you raise a very good point. What are we going to do to make sure that people all over the world can hear an honest accounting of what is news and what is happening?
Okay, you mentioned sanctions, and
Yes.
this, in my belief, have worked pretty well, actually, and stopped Russia to be more aggressive against the neighbors, but still we have to be very vigilant. And to work together. After you passed the sanction bill, there was quite a lot of questions in the European Union about how they will affect some of the EU companies. How do you see this actually in a process of cooperation between EU and US?
Well, it's a very good question, obviously. The reality is that most of these sanctions are focused upon President Putin. Why? Because at this point in Russia, he's the richest man in Russia, and he primarily has become very wealthy through his connection to the energy sector, as well as the arms export sector. So if you look at where we're trying to focus the sanctions, it's to make certain that there is an understanding, that there is a penalty to those who are in power and who are the beneficiaries of this. And so, like in anything else, there are trade-offs, but the reality is that if we can get an understanding, and if we can get Moscow to the table with Europe and with the United States, I think there is so much to be gained, because at that point, we can have some of this behavior addressed. We can get a different approach moving forward. And at that point, you know, if we can have a resolution of these problems, we then will lift the pressure and moving forward. But it's something we had to do, because we cannot allow what transpired in eastern Ukraine. We cannot allow that behavior to expand.
And lastly, if I may, to come back for a short question about trade again. Yes. In my opinion, actually, this EU-US possible trade deal could play a vital role bringing our transatlantic relations to an entire new level. Yes. What do you think, right, how far we are actually still to get back on the track with our mutual negotiations?
In reality, the tariffs are pretty low right now, but there's so much trade that even a little reduction creates tremendous synergy. At the same time, when you're talking about this body of trade, it is half the GDP of the world when we're talking about Europe and the United States and the trading arrangement. Just in terms of what it means in worldwide trade, it would be 30% of all worldwide trade. Estonia is very well positioned, obviously, with respect to you know, the way that you have this focus, so many hard science degrees, so much focus on you know, digitalization, so much focus on liberalized trade in Estonia. So it would be very good for economic growth here. It is a win-win for the United States and Europe. And I think you saw the attitude here with the Speaker of the House when he was here, and last week with the Vice President of the United States. And I, as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, we were all very much focused on how we can get this on track. And I have had great meetings here in Estonia today, and I'm looking forward tomorrow to learning more. So we will continue to push forward, and I think this is just the beginning. But let's also reflect on how far we've come, how far Estonia's come, how far the world has come. In a short period of time. And you're right, there have been setbacks, but let's get back on offense in terms of doing the right thing.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're back here now, and before I go and introduce my panelist here, I would like to ask you kindly to put up your request for questions and comments also. But first to speak in panel is my very good friend Bob NURICK. You have seen as a think tanker for many years development of relations on both sides, from Washington, from London, Helsinki. Also, you have served as a director of Carnegie Center in Moscow for many years. So you have a experience and also to see how the perhaps also political leadership in different countries, including in your country, has shaped these relations. Bob, what is your take?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's been very interesting so far and will continue to be. I've been asked to talk about, to give a perspective from Washington about issues and prospects for transatlantic relations under the Trump presidency. Now, I should say at the outset that this is something that I find in many respects to be a difficult and to some degree, awkward task. Difficult because transatlantic relations covers an awful lot of territory. And obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover all the important issues. So I will concentrate on a few, which I hope are of particular relevance, especially in this part of the world. And awkward because, on the one hand, I certainly understand all the concerns in Europe about this presidency and what it means. And to telegraph my own biases, I share many of them. But as an American here, I also feel like I need to do a bit of a balancing act. I don't want to induce overreaction, much less panic, which I don't think is called for. But I don't want to pretend there's nothing to worry about. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we do have an impulsive and unpredictable president who at the moment is overseeing an administration which in some areas related to foreign and defense policy looks stronger and more settled to me than it did a few months ago, but not in others, where there's still an awful lot of uncertainty about how both people and policy will shape up. And working in a political environment in Washington, which is as partisan as I can ever recall. So this is not the healthiest time, and it's not just because of the Trump presidency. So there are things to worry about. But given all this, it seems to me forecasting what the administration is going to do is hazardous on the one hand, but necessary on the other. What should we expect? What should we plan for? As I say, what I will do is try to hazard a few observations about a couple of issues in particular. Relations with NATO and engagement with NATO, policies towards non-NATO partners, which I think are more troublesome, Russia policy, and last but by no means least, attitudes toward and engagement and policies towards the European Union. So first, NATO. I have to say this is one area where I am considerably more optimistic, more confident than I was even a few months ago. Everyone here, I'm sure, will recall what Mr. Trump had to say about NATO as a campaigner, and early in his presidency, it's obsolete, it's looking at the wrong issues, the NATO allies are taking advantage of the US, they're not paying their fair share and the like. He's since decided that NATO maybe is not obsolete, and the burden sharing issue is still there. I'll come back to it in a moment. But it doesn't have quite the same purchase that it did even a few months ago. But the main reasons I have for increased confidence in at least day-to-day engagement on NATO issues and commitments to Article 5 really are three. One is simply the people that are now in positions of real authority in the government. General McMaster, General Mattis, now Mr. Kelly. These are people with very strong instincts about these issues, have really pushed policy very clearly in what I consider to be the right directions. You've seen the results, both about U.S. engagement, about forward presence, about increased funding for forward presence, and the like. So that's one reason. And they're supported by what I think is really quite a strong bipartisan consensus in the Congress about these issues. So whatever Mr. Trump's instincts may be, he would face an enormous amount of pushback, not only both from inside his administration and from the Congress, were he really to back off on these issues, on the commitments to NATO, at least day to day. And the third reason is that this is a bit more speculative, but frankly, the more I listen to Mr. Trump, the more persuaded I am that with the exception of the burden sharing issue, NATO engagement is not really something that engages him very much. It's not something he cares as much about as a lot of others. It's maybe in his head, but it's not so much in his stomach. And the result of that is that he's done what he apparently did a lot when he was in real estate, which is to defer and convey an awful lot of authority to people underneath him to say, you guys take care of it. And that's essentially what he's done. He's really given a lot of leeway to the Secretary of Defense, to the head of security, of the National Security Council and the like. Now, where am I less confident? Well, first of all, there is a conditionality attached to this. In this respect, Mr. Trump's language, both in general and specifically, is something I haven't heard before. The notion that allies need to do more and spend more is not new. It didn't start with Mr. Trump. You will have heard it from former Secretary Gates. We heard it from people in the Obama administration. But the notion that the U.S. commitment to Article 5 might be conditional on spending enough is something I've never heard before, and I understand why it was a source of real concern in Europe. In that respect, the so-called 2% standard of defense spending matters. There's a lot of criticism of it, that that standard is arbitrary, that it reflects an input, not an output, that it doesn't encompass all sorts of non-military, non-defense-related contributions to security. All that's true. It remains the case, however, that it still has political symbolism and importance, therefore, in the Congress. And it's for that reason I think it is important that NATO allies make and demonstrate progress in meeting the commitments that they took on at the last two NATO summits. I think the record is good. The case can be made. It has to be continued. Where am I less confident? Well, one area has to do with U.S. administration policies towards commitments toward non-NATO members. Here, I'm not talking about Sweden and Finland, but Georgia and Ukraine. Again, there's a lot of good talk for the administration, talk by people in positions of authority. I think they mean it. There's considerable support for strong engagement in both areas among a lot of OSD officials and in the Congress and the like. There's also now a budding sort of subculture in the broader non-governmental policy community on these two issues. All that's to the good. What this will produce in practice, concretely in practice, is a little bit less clear to me, and I think, frankly, to the Georgians and Ukrainians. In the case of Georgia, I can tell you from personal experience that people there are concerned not that the administration is going to do something terrible, but that simply that Georgia will just kind of disappear from the agenda. So they know that membership is not in the cards for the foreseeable future, but they want to keep Georgia on the agenda. The big issue, though, is Ukraine. Again, here too, there are a lot of strong statements of support from key officials. There's a lot of congressional interest. We've seen the appointment of a special ambassador, Kurt Volker, to deal with both the Ukrainians and to talk to the Russians. There's a lot to sort out there, though. The big issue, which I think is going to be quite divisive even in Washington, and I assume in Europe too, has to do with provision of lethal aid. I don't know where this is going to be. This is one area where I think I would be surprised if Donald Trump left it simply up to officials to decide. So we'll see. Aside from that, aside from what happens in the purely defense area, as important it is as that is, as important I think is that it is that Ukraine, like any sovereign nation, be able to defend itself. The bigger issue over the longer run is its viability as a competent democratic state. And this is going to require economic and political engagement of a sort I'm less sure about, and where I will, just to note right now, where there'll be a much bigger role, not for NATO, but for the European Union. I'll come back to that in a few moments. Now, underlying all these other issues, of course, has to do with Russia policy. Again, people have heard, I'm sure you're all familiar with what Mr. Trump had to say about this as a campaigner. And during the immediate post-inaugural period, he talked about the need for better relations. He stressed U.S. interests in doing so, expressed admiration for Putin. And one result is that early on there was concern in the U.S., and I think here too, about the possibility that he was going to strike a so-called grand bargain, one which would try to accommodate these interests, pursue some U.S. interests, but over the heads of and perhaps at the expense of a lot of allies, not least those in this region. Now, this concern is gone. Nobody thinks a grand bargain is going to be struck, and indeed, relations, bilateral relations, are now, I think, at their lowest point that I can recall since the darkest days of the Cold War. So the question really now is now what? Given this, what should the U.S. do? And there is an ongoing but intensifying debate in Washington about this. If you talk to people in the policy community and ask them, should the U.S. and how should the U.S. engage or re-engage with Russia, virtually everyone, without exception, will give an answer which is some version of yes, but. The problem is they have very different ideas about both sides of that phrase. They differ about the yes side, that is what we should engage about, what the priorities should be, what's desirable and what's feasible. And there are big differences on the but side, what we should avoid and what the conditions should be. These are all issues, of course, which have major impact here in Europe. My own view is that what is both feasible and desirable, at least in the near term, is going to be a fairly limited agenda, focusing not entirely but primarily on some hard defense issues. That is, working out some arrangements on crisis management, on nuclear policy, and on things like Syria. There's another area which everybody agrees in principle is a candidate for collaboration and cooperation, namely work on terrorism. Most people would agree that in principle this is very desirable. What we found is that in practice it's not so easy. So this is another area that's going to be on the agenda and difficult. In any case, the broader question of U.S.-Russian bilateral relations and its implications for European security is not going to go away. Indeed, I think it's going to become more central in the near future. Where does this lead us to the final issue, which has to do with the European Union? Many of you, I think here we need to go back and do a little history. Many of you will recall the famous St. Malo Declaration of 1998. This is the declaration of Jacques Chirac and Tony Blair, which called for the European Union to establish strategic autonomy based on serious defense and a set of policy processes which would allow the European Union to make its own decisions about what to do. You may also recall what the reaction of the then U.S. administration was in the form of then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who really talked about the so-called 3 Ds, things to avoid. What they reflected was a real concern in Washington that this was going to weaken NATO. This was going to pull the European Union away from collaboration with NATO, that it was going to pull European defense spending and priorities away from NATO, and therefore should be avoided. Now, a lot of these concerns have, I think, faded in Washington, but they haven't disappeared. And therefore are going to need to be treated with some care. Given the discussion earlier today, a couple of thoughts come to mind, and then I'll conclude. The first is, frankly, that Washington is in need of an education about the European Union. I can tell you the European Union simply is not well understood in the District of Columbia. There are some people in the State Department and a couple of other departments who have dealt with the European Union, who worry about EU issues, who have some sense of how it works, who know who to talk to. There's also a group of people in the broader policy community outside the government who have done the same. I can tell you both are limited. The number of people who really know how the EU works now, much less how it might work and what the debates are small. So there's a responsibility in Washington, given the fact, as we've heard this morning, that I think the EU, I think it's clear the EU is going to be looking to be more active in this in ways that the U.S. has a stake in. This gets me to the other side of the equation, which is I do think that this is an area where there's going to have to be a bit of a balancing act on the part of Europe. Because I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what I've heard this morning about the need for a more coherent European policy in a lot of areas, including on security policy and defense. I would not be sorry at all to see a lot of the basic impetus behind the ideas of the Malo Declaration put into effect. But I would just caution on two grounds. I do think it's important that the EU, in doing all this, that the EU coordinate closely with NATO. And that means, and there are a lot of good signs about agreements about cooperation. It looks much better than it did even a few years ago. But these agreements need to have real meat, and they have to be put into real effect. Secondly is to keep the U.S., I do think it's important to keep the U.S. in the loop, not as a veto power, but important to continue to interact on these issues and EU planning on these issues with the administration, with the Congress, and with the broader policy community. Trump, as much as he's a source of concern for all of us, and I have to admit, including very much for me, he's not the whole of the U.S. government, and he's not going to last forever. And it seems to me the last thing that Europe wants to do is to create what is essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is to take actions which reinforces the instincts of and the excuse of some in the United States for the U.S. to disengage. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. You covered a lot of ground here, and hopefully we come back through questions to the debate. And now we have the excellent opportunity to look at the United States from cabinet of Mr. Tusk from Brussels. I'm very glad to introduce Mr. Wouter COUSSENS. He's an advisor to Mr. Tusk, and he's working currently in his cabinet on economic and foreign policy matters with a focus on the United States and Canada, and your previous experience as also official in ESCB, both seeing this part of the world or issues from Washington and from Frankfurt. So, Wouter, please.
Thank you. Maybe let me make first three preliminary points. As you've mentioned, the first point would be that I am indeed have a background in economics. I'm a former central banker, so I feel a bit in foreign territory. So I feel a bit like a fish on the mainland, but okay, I'll do my best. The second point also relates to the ECB. Earlier today, Mr. Stubb said that in his pitch for the EIB, he said the EIB was the. Wait, let me put this a bit higher. The EIB was is that clear?
It's okay. It's okay.
The EIB was Europe's good bank. I would say that's not entirely accurate. I would say there's two good banks. There's the ECB and the EIB. And the last preliminary point is just the usual caveat that what I say here today are my personal views and not necessarily those of my president. So having said that, let me thank the organizers for this very timely event. It's very timely because, as we've heard, and everybody has seen that in the media, we've had an incoming US administration whose position on Europe, whose position on the transatlantic relationship was anything but clear, was sometimes concerning, and was also quite unpredictable. So clearly a very timely debate it is. But I would say, and it's a bit in line with what Bob said, I think we should not dramatize the situation. We need to put things into perspective. And just to quote my president, President Tusk, the reports of the death of the West, he said, have been greatly exaggerated. So So let me make 3 points of sort of trying to put things into perspective. First of all, we have a long relationship. We've had issues in the past, difficult times, disagreements in the past, and we're certainly going to have them in the future. But despite those disagreements in the past, we've always sort of remained friends, we've always remained partners, and it's important to keep that in mind. The second point of perspective relates not to time, but more to persons, and it's similar to what Bob said. We should not sort of generalize when it comes to statements of one person. The US is not one person, the EU is not one person. And I think here there was a nice quote the other week by Senator McCain when he gave a speech here in Italy, where he said, our foreign friends always tend to focus on the person in the White House, but America is far bigger than that. And I think that's very true. And we heard earlier from the video conference that what the congressman said. So clearly within Congress, but also more widely, I think there's still in the US a bit bipartisan support for the alliance and for Europe. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. The third sort of point where I say we need to put things into perspective is that we should not only look at political statements or statement by political figures. We also need to look at the sort of the facts on the ground underpinning our relation. And that relation is indeed very, very profound. It has, if you look, for instance, at the economic facts, it is truly remarkable how closely intertwined our economies are. And the truth of the matter is that the trade and investment flows between Europe and the US still dwarf those of any other partner. And those will, in all likelihood, remain. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Now, does that mean everything is fine? Absolutely not. And but it's clearly also not as troubled, our relationship, as it sometimes is portrayed in the press. I think today's debate is very timely because it does allow us to think about ways to further reinvigorate this relationship. And when I was sort of preparing these remarks, I stumbled into a speech by Javier Solana, the EU's first High Representative, which he gave in 2003. Also a very difficult time, as you will remember, for the transatlantic relations, with very intense debates between the two partners, but also within Europe on the sort of legality of the Iraq War, etc. And so he gave this speech in the US in 2003. And when I read that speech, I was struck by a fact that he put out 4 principles of how to reinvigorate the relationship. And it struck me that how those 4 principles are actually still very relevant today, if not more relevant today. So let me run you through those 4 principles of Javier Solana in 2003. The first principle, he said, is we need to reaffirm that we are allies and partners and treat each other in that way. In a way, it reminded me when I read that of what my son told me the other day when he came home from school. He told me, Daddy, I learned about friendship, and I learned the golden rule of friendship. If you want a friend, be a friend. And I think that also applies to the transatlantic relationship. We live in a world which is becoming more and more multipolar. We have several new emerging powers on the global scene, unapologetically and sometimes selfishly, unashamedly pursuing their own narrow interests. So if we Europeans and Americans want to survive and thrive in this new world, we must stand together and we must be seen to be standing together. And I think that is why it's important that, for instance, when Vice President Pence visited Europe in February, he said, that he made it very clear that the US supports a close transatlantic cooperation and unequivocally supports the idea of a united Europe. And it's also why it was very important that later on President Trump made it clear during his visit in Poland that the US stands firmly behind NATO's mutual defense commitment, and that, and I quote, a strong Europe is a blessing to the West and to the world. That was the first principle. Treat each other as friends and make it be seen that you are friends. The second principle, each partner needs to make its fair contribution to the partnership. Now, at the time when he made the speech in 2003, Javier Solana pointed out that obviously on the US side there is a disenchantment or misgivings about the fact that the Europeans were not always contributing their fair share when it came to defense. Today, as we've heard also from Trump, this feeling is probably even more heartfelt. But I would say there is some good news on the European side. There's now a general awareness amongst leaders and amongst the EU leaders that they will need to bear a much greater part of the burden in ensuring security, both at home and abroad, both in a NATO and in an EU context. And this came out clearly during the last NATO summit. I think it's also important to sort of, as you all have seen, that later on, 2 weeks later, during the June summit, EU leaders agreed in principle on the need to set up a permanent European cooperation in defense, in our jargon, the PESCO. And I think sometimes people have not treated that with enough importance. I think it's a truly seminal development for the European Union. And our hope is that at the December summit, the EU leaders will see to it that this PESCO gets off the ground, and they will also decide on how to take further the EU's cooperation with NATO. I think we have in mind what you said about not doing this at the expense of NATO. The third principle that Solana put out is that we have these shared capabilities, but we need to use those to tackle causes and not just symptoms. I think that's a key principle also today, because we have so many global problems requiring our attention, and so we need to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where we are so busy mopping the floor that we forget to turn off the tap. This is true for global warming, and there at least the EU has taken a leading role by brokering the Paris Agreement and now pushing for an ambitious implementation, and we will need the support of all partners to see to that. It is true for the migration crisis, and again there I think the EU is on a good path in trying to sort of dealing with that, not just dealing with the inflows, but also dealing with the root causes by sort of granting support to the countries of origin and improving the situation there, and thereby stemming the outflows of migrants. And it is true also for terrorism. I think it is always good to work on police cooperation, etc., but we also need to think about tackling the causes of terrorism, taking away the fertile breeding ground here in Europe for the homegrown terrorists, but also abroad. As the saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So in all these areas, we will need the full support of the US, but we also need the full support of parliaments. The fourth and final principle that Solana put forward, and then I conclude, is that we need to act together to sustain a world order based on rules and shared values. And I think that's probably the most important principle. What's really underlying this transatlantic relation is exactly this attachment to some fundamental values that have been pointed out before. Values like democracy, human rights, free trade, open markets. They are the bedrock of this relationship. Now, in the light of those values, inspired by these values, I think we should not forget that past US and European leaders have been the ones putting in place a world order to sustain those values. We were there when the UN was created. We set up the Bretton Woods institutions, the OECD, later on the G20, the FSB. And thanks to that, we have now a world order where the rule of law prevails over the rule of force, where the common interest prevails over narrow national ones. And to uphold our key values, we need to show ownership for this world order. The West played a key role in the construction of this order. We must now take care not to allow its destruction. Because we should be under no illusion. If the West leaves a vacuum of leadership in the world, then others who may not share our values will fill it. And if the West does not champion free trade or stand up for our values, then probably no one else will. And that's why I would say, and that's my concluding remark, the transatlantic alliance not only remains a cornerstone for the West, but it is also a crucial element in providing stability to the global, to the world order. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for these comprehensive two introductory statements to the transatlantic issues. Now I have a privilege to open the floor for questions, as promised. We have, at least at the beginning, 1 minute for each one of the speakers from the audience. And the first one up is Carlos Costa Neves from Portugal. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Chair. A comment and one question in 1 minute. The comment is, I took note that Mr. Robert NURICK said that the European Union is not understood in the United States. And I also took note that Congressman ROYCE makes several references to Estonia and several references to world trade, but not to the European Union about TTIP. So I want to register this. The question is about burden sharing. There's a lot of political symbolism in the 2%, and I want to ask you to share your idea about how serious the European Union countries are taking this commitment to the 2% of GDP until 2024 in expenditures in security and defense. Thank you.
Thank you, dear panelists. Please.
Well, on this question, as I mentioned before, this is a politically important question in Washington. People do pay attention to it. It is important that the case can be made that Europeans in general are moving in the right directions. That is not to say, I think, that people are going to look at every detail of those commitments. And indeed, when you talk to people privately, I don't think very many people expect that the 2% standard is going to be met throughout Europe. And they understand that in some cases it will be very difficult. And I'll start with the obvious one, in many ways the most important one in terms of spending, which is Germany. German spending has been very low. If it is increasing quickly. But as many Germans have pointed out quite correctly, given the size of that economy, going to 2% would mean an enormous change. And that, on the one hand, they can certainly add a lot, and I think should, to European capabilities. But it's important that this money be spent wisely, which probably means not too quickly. And secondly, that's going to require an adjustment inside Europe, because suddenly Germany is going to have a much weightier place in overall defense capabilities than it's had before. So it's important. The standard is important, but not always to be taken absolutely literally, I think.
Yeah, would you care to comment?
Yeah, maybe largely on the same lines in a way. I think indeed, in fairness, the jury is out. We will have to see. We'll also have to see what role the establishment of PESCO can play in that regard. But I would definitely also echo the point about the need to spend wisely. And I think it's important to explore ways to sort of ensure the efficiency of that spending. And in that regard, I think the recent initiatives of the Commission have been very helpful, these ideas on European Defence Fund, etc. So this is also something that is part of the three-pillar strategy that has been laid out, and so we will come back to that. The EIB will have a role to play, as Alex Stubb mentioned earlier. So I think there's progress, we're on a good path. Whether how strong that commitment will turn out to be, we shall see.
Well, if I could just add something I should have mentioned, I entirely agree with that. The one thing that I do think that over time needs to be addressed is to have a serious conversation about how, in fact, we ought to measure and assess contributions to security and defense policy. Spending is obviously part of it. That's easy. But it's not the whole story. And on the one hand, it's not going to be useful simply to go to the Congress and say, well, you know, we Europeans do other things, so leave us alone. But it is going to be important to go to the policy community and say there are other ways that we need to assess what we do and how we do it. And to be a lot clearer about that. And this is one of the things I would hope, among other things, will be discussed in the European Union and discussed jointly with NATO at the next summit.
Let me just add, I'd say, just to echo that, security is at the end of the day a multidimensional problem, and hence military means can be one element of that, but others may be necessary as well. And we should never forget, indeed, as the President pointed out earlier, Europe is also contributing in other ways a lot to security, like its development budget, like the enlargement process, etc., like its partnerships with the Eastern world. Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right there.
Yeah. Thank you. We go to our speakers from member states. Erkki Tuomioja from Finland, please.
I'm not sure we can talk about the transatlantic relationship as a community of values today. There is the other America, which had a popular majority, which shares most of our values, but I do not share the values of those who question climate.
Translation is going over the translation problem.
Excuse us, the translation was there, but this is not necessary. Erkki, please.
Okay, I don't share the values of those who are engaged in climate change denial, support the death penalty, do not support gender equality or other human rights, who are for unilateralism and protectionism in international relations, and are working for wealth concentration instead of wealth sharing. But that said, we are a community of interests, and obviously we need to work together on the world economy, on managing threats and to security, for stability and peace and so on. But at the same time, I think we should be clear and speak out about the challenge to our values from whatever quarter they come from, even from the United States. Because otherwise we will be letting down that America which shares our European values. Thank you.
Thank you. Would like to respond?
Well, I agree. I mean, certainly with the notion that shared values look much different given what we've heard from the president. But in particular, this is, as I mentioned before, he's not the whole country. And these are issues in the U.S. as well. The things that you object to and which I object to are not even universally shared among people who voted for Donald Trump. So it's a lot more complicated than that, and I certainly agree that Europe should feel absolutely free to stand up for what it believes, both for its own sake, and to make it clear to those in the U.S. that Europe cares about what we do. As I mentioned before, the worst thing that I can imagine is a sense in the U.S. that Europe is disengaging.
Okay, please, the next person to ask the question is a representative from Iceland, and I'll try to get it right now. Jonas Solveig Elinardottir, please, the floor is yours.
Perfect, thank you. Well, I would like to highlight a point that I feel that we politicians must keep in mind when we debate Western unity, and that you have touched upon here today, when it comes to Western unity and transatlantic collaboration. First of all, the importance of upholding and nurturing values of liberal democracy. We must be careful not to shy away from these common values that bind us together. That is one of my biggest worries, that we will give in too much into populist, borderline fascist, misogynistic forces to appease frustrated voters. We risk giving into what we perceive as public opinion, but what in my view is not a call for backwards policies, but a call for more justice, more equality, more liberal democracy, not less. But my question to the panelists is, could and should the EU assume a leadership role, fill in the vacuum that we have mentioned here today in Western and transatlantic relations in fields that the current US administration is now less active than previous administrations? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, panelists.
I think the answer is yes. I think we should try. I think we are trying to do that in certain areas. I've mentioned climate change. There's another important area which is trade, which has been touched upon earlier, where indeed I think we are sort of trying to continue to defend the trade order that we have put in place, but also to continue to engage and find ways to bring forward the trade agenda with various countries and regions in the world. So we're trying, but it will require a united Europe if we want to do that. And I think to add the point that I made earlier, which is the more we can collaborate with US, if we can have the US by our side, then the more successful we will be.
I agree. I have nothing to add to that. I agree.
Okay, with next now to Latvia, Mr. Ojārs, Erik Kalniņš, please, Ojārs.
Yes, actually my question has already been talked about burden sharing. I just wanted to return to that, and I agree with what Robert NURICK said, that in a way the debate's been hijacked by focusing just on the 2% without talking about capabilities or contributions. And I think two countries that are a great example of that are Denmark and Canada, both of whom are under 2%, yet Denmark has been one of the most active participants in foreign operations. Canada has been very active in Afghanistan. They've lost over 158 soldiers. It doesn't matter whether they're at 2% or not, they're contributors. Even the Baltics, by next year, all three Baltic states will reach 2%, but the sum total of our defense expenditures don't compare to what Germany spends, even though they're under. And I guess just quick question, Robert, can we change the debate in the Congress? Can we focus on these other aspects beyond just increasing defense expenditure? Can we get them to understand that it is capabilities and other types of contributions? Thank you.
Oh.
Yeah, I do think it's possible. I mean, there are plenty of people who understand that now. We don't hear about much of this in the public debate, but if you talk to congressional staffers, talk to Congress members of the House and the Senate, there are plenty of people who understand that now. What you need to avoid is coming to Washington and pushing this issue as if it's a way to get people to pay no attention to the spending issue. That issue will not go away. But I do think it is very possible, and as I mentioned before, necessary to have a more complicated, serious debate about how you measure contributions. And I think Europe has a good case in a number of areas, including, and I should mention this, in the area which Donald Trump has identified as his highest priority, namely the fight against radical Islamic terrorism. You can talk about what militaries can do and what NATO can do, and yes, they have a role, both directly and in training and so on, but an awful lot of what has to be done is done by civilian institutions. It's going to require collaboration with police departments, with border guards, to say nothing of what was mentioned before, the underlying causes. And these are areas where the EU has a lot more capability and mandate than NATO does. So this is one area where you can complicate this debate in very useful ways on a subject which will have, I think, real purchase for Donald Trump.
Okay, in that case, we'll go to the next question by the Finnish rep, Ilkka Kanerva. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Even if there are very many ways to calculate your military expenditures in different countries, anyway, we understand the idea of the 2%. For example, my country is close to that in the years to come. But instead of 2%, I would like to suggest the idea about 3%, of course, including those military expenditures, but also in the names of the multilateral problems we have in the security in various ways. Instead of 2%, I suggest that there's a need for 3%, including military costs, but also humanitarian aid, development aid, and especially all the costs of the diplomacy, international diplomacy. And that's why it would be in the names of the multilateral problems of security, I should suggest that instead of 2%, there's a real need for the 3% stocks.
It's an interesting idea. And yeah, I think to some extent I would say, I was thinking then we already have also in parallel, or in addition to the 2, we have the 0.7 in terms of development. So indeed, yeah, I think we would then have the 3% norm for fiscal deficits, and we could have the 3% norm for doing good things in the world. So that's, yeah, I think it's a good idea.
I'm a little, I mean, I understand the impulse behind that, have some sympathy for it. I'm a little bit hesitant about the idea of substituting one arbitrary figure for another one. I do think, as I mentioned before, we need to have a much more complicated debate. I'd be a little bit careful about what we include in that debate. And we can go way beyond defense expenditures. I would like to see a lot more attention to humanitarian aid, foreign aid, and so on, diplomatic initiatives by the U.S. So it's not that I discount those in the slightest. But there will be parts of the U.S. establishment, particularly in Republicans in the Congress, who I'm afraid, if they hear that, will say, well, this is simply a way to do all the easy stuff. You guys, you Europeans want to do soft power. You're going to leave it all up to the U.S. to do the tough, hard power. You need to be, I'm exaggerating here, but I think this is, you need to be a little bit careful about not playing into that instinct.
Okay, our next speaker comes from Norway, Mr. Øyvind Holleraker, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to make a comment to excellent speakers. Our transatlantic relations are close and deep, but must continually nurture and develop. These include cooperation on security and defense policy. NATO, as a key institution in this regard, must adapt to both familiar and new security challenges. At the same time, Europe must also take greater share of responsibility for our own security. This is why Norway very much welcomed the strengthened cooperation between EU member states and on security and defense. However, as a representative of a NATO member that is on the outside of the EU, I'm convinced that developments in the EU defense policy can only happen in close cooperation with NATO. I'd like to have your opinion on that. Thank you.
Please.
I can only repeat what I said before. I think this is critical. I think it can be done. There have been good steps taken already in that direction, a number of agreements for cooperation on logistics, on intelligence sharing, a number of other issues and the like just in the last few years. But I think that this kind of cooperation, collaboration, joint planning and the like has to be reinforced. So I entirely agree.
Same here. Exactly the same message.
Okay, Karin Enström from Sweden, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to get back to trade, since I think we have the two cornerstones, security and trade, when it comes to transatlantic relations. So, in your opinion, from both of you, what would be the best arguments or the best way to motivate the current administration and the president to go on and to strengthen the efforts when it comes to a transatlantic trade and investment, agreement or partnership, if it's TTIP or, I don't mind, it's not important what we call it, but to really come forward, because that would be extremely beneficiary for both the EU and the US. So what would be the best arguments, the best reasons? What can we do as a European Union to try to strengthen all the good forces that would like to see an agreement like this? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, it's a very good question.
Yes.
Now, in an ideal world, you would try to convince the president with economic facts and figures, and the economic analysis is crystal clear. That this, whilst indeed, as the congressman laid out earlier, we have already a very close trade relationship. We have lowered tariffs significantly already. There is still a lot of untapped economic potential there. So this is sort of how you would, in an ideal world, try to convince this administration that this is a worthwhile goal to pursue. Now, that being said, and it's more of a personal remark, I think we may have to do, we're not in an ideal world for a start, and we may have to do some education also here, in the sense that it seems that some people within the administration have a, how should I put it, a rather peculiar view on trade flows, which is not necessarily backed up by the economics, in the sense that if your starting point in any trade negotiation is that you cannot end up with having a trade deficit, that obviously complicates matters, and it also doesn't exactly show a good understanding of what actually underlies trade deficit or trade surpluses. At the end of the day, the US, Europe, for instance, is a very, very open economy. And with some countries, with the outside world, we have trade deficit, and with others, we have trade surpluses. So it's much more to do with the underlying economic balances within a country that determine whether or not you have a trade surplus or a trade deficit. Now, that economic wisdom is not necessarily prevalent in all corners of this U.S. administration. And so that's a big problem going forward. And another big problem is that, in light also of that economic philosophy that is theirs, they then pursue a certain inquiries, etc. You have the steel investigations, things like that. Those things do not help in creating a fertile breeding ground for relaunching our work on trade.
I agree. It's a very good question. I wish I had good answers. I don't. I would simply note a couple of things. One is that this is, I think, an issue that Donald Trump feels in his stomach, that he cares about. And he's been quite clear about what he thinks about it. I think it's very unfortunate. It's misguided. But I think it's something he feels strongly about. In terms of arguments, there are big debates even within the administration. There's certainly a lot going on by the U.S. business community about what their interests are. And I think to a large degree, you're going to have to leave it to Americans to define what American interests are in trade. It wouldn't be good to try to lecture the U.S. on American interests. What you can do and will need to do is make sure that people in the U.S., including Donald Trump, but especially the people around him, understand what the consequences would be of some of the things he intends to do and how they might affect the U.S. economy. They're starting to hear those messages already, but that's where I think Europe needs to do is to talk about what could come from this, what the implications would be, and then leave it to the Americans to make the arguments that say this is not good.
Maybe just one qualifier, because I realize I was maybe a bit rather negative. I think, in spite of the rhetoric that we sometimes hear, we also get from the administration clear indications of engagement. And actually, when President Trump visited President Tusk and President Juncker in May, they sort of agreed on the idea of sort of thinking about launching some sort of trade action plan. So it is a rather contradictory situation. On the one hand, you sort of hear sometimes very negative rhetoric, but sometimes you also hear very positive rhetoric. You also had Wilbur Ross making some pronouncements on TTIP. So it's a rather strange, or it's a rather difficult environment that we're facing, with sometimes contradictions that are not making it any easier for us to engage.
If I may just to ask, as one argument perhaps in this field could be China, or isn't? At least when I have had opportunities to discuss with colleagues from US Congress, actually this has been in their mind sort of, but okay, let's create finally the sort of standardization among North America and Europe.
Absolutely right. I think that's a key point indeed, that if we were to really go down this route again, then clearly we could become the standard setters, if you wish, of what is a good trade deal. And then one can then, in that regard, then also take into account things like social and environmental standards much more, think about how to deal with investment and disputes, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think even when that is true, we would still have to deal separately in the relevant fora with China. I think that's clearly an issue going forward. Yeah.
Great, thanks. The next speaker from Estonia, Parvi Pilvre, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is about the conflict around climate issues. And we know that one of the conflict issues is different understanding of climate policy, and what in the long run can mean also problems in world security, as part of the world has polluted water or no water at all, and we are all very worried about it. So could you comment on that? Is there any solution? Is there a light in the end of the tunnel, as the US point of view on climate change has been like very hesitating? So do you see any solution or change in the future in this issue?
Well, first of all, let me say, I mean, despite what you hear from the administration, or at least parts of the administration, this isn't one issue in which there is a very, very large consensus that climate change is real, and that economic policy contributes to it in important ways. Now, it's not what you hear from Donald Trump. But it's what you hear from 90% of the scientific, 97% of the scientific community. It's what you'd hear from most in the Congress, but not all. Donald Trump is talking a different tune. There is an important political aspect to this, which, frankly, the supporters of serious action on climate change haven't addressed seriously enough, and that is the costs internally of adaptation. There's been, we know what we have to do, and there's not a lot of mystery about that. But just to give one example, a major part of Donald Trump's constituency in the last election had to do with parts of Appalachia whose economies were based on coal. And it's fine to say stop burning coal. I agree, but the people who say that need a strategy to deal with the people who are going to be in very bad economic situation when that happens. We didn't do it, and the support for Donald Trump was one of the costs of that lacuna. So I do think I'm not going to pretend that I think that Donald Trump is going to change his mind. He is very much in the position of pandering to his core constituency. That's small, but it's not going anywhere. Maybe only 33% of the voting population, but that's what he's got. And he's going to, I think, on these issues, he's going to stick to it. So you're going to have to rely a lot more on what happens in the Congress and what happens after Trump. And there, I think, the politics are very, very different. So yes, I do think there's a possibility of change, but this is, for all sorts of domestic political reasons, this is not going to be cost-free or easy. And the people who want change are going to have to take some of these economic issues much more seriously than I think they have so far.
Thank you. And the next one up is Urmas Paet from the European Parliament. Please, Urmas.
Thank you very much. First, my sentence goes to some of my colleagues who seem still be very worried on the European Defence Union. I guess it's absolutely obvious that European defence developments go and will go hand in hand with NATO. On transatlantic issues, transatlantic cooperation, we all know that governments come and go. So that in this regard, I'm also absolutely sure that also US will return to the negotiations with the EU what concerns free trade, because it's obvious two close allies, be it politically, economically, security-wise, it's absolutely logical that rather sooner than later we also return to these negotiations. But my questions to the speakers will touch the issues related to military cooperation between European countries and the United States, be it potentially in the future, also now. We have one very clear hotspot and problem, it is ISIS, and also US activities and activities of some European countries in Middle East against ISIS. But I see that this activity is very modest if you look what's going on in European capitals and the risks also which are in the United States related to terrorism and ISIS. And then second is potential issue of North Korea. So that in this regard, how you see, can and should European countries and US do more together also what concerns military in these two very practical security risks? Thank you.
Well, I'll try to be very, very quick about it. On the first one, as I mentioned before, I do think there's a need for a lot more cooperation for a simple reason that really dealing with terrorism in general, including with ISIS, is NATO has a role to play, defense has a role to play, but it goes way beyond that. and the kinds of capabilities that need to be brought to bear. Many of them are much more in the competencies and authorities of the European Union. So again, this is going to require close planning and collaboration, but that's one where I think it's clear. On North Korea, I mean, I worry a lot about it, about this. I don't think for all the bluster that either side wants war, but I can, it's not as difficult as I'd like to imagine circumstances in which we could stumble into one, where things could go wrong, and we'd have some kind of conflict there. What I'm not sure about is how and where Europe can best intervene to push negotiations. Because I think it's clear to me this is, in fact, despite the rhetoric, this is what the U.S. would like. And a lot of Trump's harsh rhetoric is, I think, to try to get North Korea to the table. They've shown no inclination to do it. And if they do it, it would be very difficult because I think personally the one thing they would never accept is what the U.S. wants, which is denuclearization, full denuclearization. That's not going to, I think that's, for the foreseeable in this regime, not on the table. So I do think that there's probably a way that would be very useful for Europe and Russia, which is going to be a key player here as well, to try to engage along with the U.S. In trying to push China and particularly North Korea to the table to have some kind of serious negotiations on, not on denuclearization, but on transparency, rules of the road, and the like. Missile testing. There are a lot of things that I think at least are conceivable to discuss, but we're not there yet. And I don't see at the moment that we're moving in the right direction towards those kinds of talks. So I do think and would hope that Europe could engage. I don't have any illusions that no matter who engages, this is going to be easy.
Okay, now, dear friends, we have 9 minutes left to the end of this session, and our next speaker is Mr. Dirk van der Molen from Belgium. Please.
Okay, thank you. Two short questions. Having listened to Mr. Trump, I have my doubts that he is in favor of a rules-based world order. I think he tends more to a maybe military power-based order. I would like to hear arguments against this observation. Then, after some hard thinking, as a social democrat, I found a positive thing about the positions taken by Mr. Trump, that is his social concern on free trade agreements and globalizations. Was this campaign talk, or does he really mean this? What is left of this concern about the social impact of globalization and free trade, and is that something on which, a terrain on which Europe and the United States can find each other?
Thank you, Bob.
These are very good questions. I'm not going to pretend I can read Mr. Trump's mind. I have the same impression that you do about his feelings about rules-based orders. He has not been exactly emphasizing why this is important. All I can say is that the habits of the policy community more generally, including parts of that administration, are quite different. How this will work out in practice, I think, is going to vary depending on the particular issues at stake. I don't expect Donald Trump to necessarily to change his mind, although if he does, he'll say that's what he always believed. So, watch this space. This is one area where, again, he's unpredictable. About the social impact of globalization and trade issues, I think this is also, I mentioned the social impact of climate change is something we haven't, namely liberals in the U.S., like myself, have not had enough serious things to say about. I would agree on these other ones. It's a problem with the Democratic Party. When Hillary talked about the deplorables, the so-called deplorables, voting for Donald Trump, I know what she meant. But she is referring to a group of people, working class Americans, which for a long time had been the core constituency of the Democratic Party going back to the New Deal. And so I think the Democratic Party has some soul searching to do about these issues, all of them. Not to say that climate change doesn't matter, it does. Not to say that globalization can be reversed or that it's a bad thing. No to both of those, et cetera. But they have consequences for, and differential consequences internally. Some people get gain from them, other people do not. And the Democratic Party, given its traditions, I think needs to look at the latter, not just the former.
Maybe just on trade, I think, and sort of the social policy agenda of Trump. Personally, I'm rather skeptical. The jury is still out, so we'll have to see. But if sort of your approach is to say no trade or limiting trade, then probably this is not the way to go. I think the way to go, and this is what we're trying to do, I guess, in Europe, is sort of yes to free and fair trade, and at the same time we need to make sure that we deal with the consequences of that trade when it leads to dislocations at local or national level through education and what have you. So I think we'll have to see. I think what will be very interesting to watch will be the negotiations they're now having with the Canadians and the Mexicans on NAFTA. I think they've put some ideas on the table. They still have this idea, by the way, on not having a trade deficit, so we'll have to see how that pans out. But it will be interesting to see what this leads to, and then on the basis of that, yes, if we are of the same economic philosophy, then yes, I believe it should be possible to bring this trade agenda forward, including that social element in it.
Thank you. As we have 4 minutes left and there are still 3 people willing to ask a question, I will pull them together. So first one is rep from Bulgaria, Georgi Mihailov, please.
You, Mr. Chairman. My question is about the future partnership between European Union and NATO. Taking in account the serious differences between the East and West Pole of European Union, taking in account demographic characteristics and economical possibilities, and thinking from one hand for strategic autonomy of all members of the European community, on the other hand of defense of Europe and whole. What do you think about the future constructing of European army?
Okay, and we take the next question by European Parliament member Anders Vistisen, please.
Thank you. We have spent most of this time in this debate finding out all the flaws of America and this presidency. And we have also concluded today that the influence of America in the world is gone, and that the very deep and historical link that have been between Europe and America can be erased by one 4-year presidency. But maybe just to turn the table for one, what can Europe do to encourage a better transatlantic relation? We have talked a lot about free trade in this forum, but let's be honest, even if we had the most free trade president in America right now, could we get TTIP through the European Parliament and all the national parliaments? I just posed the question to the panel because I think this is a two-way street anyway, even though most of us see fault with the current US president. Maybe we should also do a little bit of soul-searching about how do we then prepare for the next one, and maybe we can then still have a relation, and maybe America will still have a small say in the world order even after Trump.
Thank you for a very good point made, and I hope the panelists will respond. The last question, and this will be the final one, is by Konrad Glebocki from Poland, please.
It will not be a question, just a small comment, therefore I will not provoke further discussion. Just a couple of things. We should have no doubt that Europe needs USA, and USA needs very much strong Europe, as it was already quoted from the speech of Mr. Trump in Warsaw. He expressed it very plainly. What could we do for the unity? I think that I would like to pay attention to one thing, but important one, that we should respect US elections results. I think that we should respect it irrespectively of our ideological likes and dislikes. That would make this cooperation much better if we would stand without any prejudices. Thank you.
Excellent. Please, could you wrap up your final comments for this excellent panel?
Maybe on TTIP first. I think it's a very good question. And we have all seen what happened with CETA, so I don't need to recall that. So I think, but at the end of the day, it would obviously depend on what's in the TTIP. You say TTIP, there's very different forms of TTIP that one may end up with, and depending also with which administration you sort of, and with what kind of attitude the other administration works on this. So it's sort of too hypothetical really to come up with a convincing answer there, I would say.
Well, very quickly, first of all, on the question of European Army, as I hope was clear from my earlier remarks, I certainly think that it's important that European defense capabilities be increased, and that the ability of Europe to take decisions to act be increased as well. Neither of those are obvious or certain to happen, but I think it would be in U.S. interest if they did. Again, provided that this was done in close collaboration with NATO and that the U.S. was engaged. It's hard for me to imagine circumstances in which European military forces would be deployed without some kind of U.S. interest at stake. Even now, that's true. When you look at, for example, French forces in Africa, there's a lot of U.S. engagement on intelligence, logistics, and so on. An independent European army, I think that will hearing that will make people in Washington nervous, but it's pretty hard I think it would be pretty hard for anyone, including people in the Trump administration, to object to increased defense capabilities, provided that this real collaboration continued. On TTIP, I have nothing at all to add to this. My colleague knows a lot more about this than I do. I certainly agree, though, that with the comment of our third speaker, that the U.S., not only Europe needs the U.S., but the U.S. needs Europe, and I think that's understood. We've got to go beyond the abstractions here and have real discussions about how that works and how it can work and how it can work better in the future than we've had in the past.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bob and Wouter. It brings us to the end of this, as it is fashionable to say, a great session. Let's thank our panelists. Also, I would like to thank you, keeping up very interesting and lively debate, and we come back to this right in the afternoon. I have 3 announcements to make. First, please know when we go for our break, follow our staffers to make our traditional family photo, which will be taken on the stairways here in the Hilton Conference Hall. And after that, we have a lunch break. Lunch will be served right next door to our plenary session hall. And please, we have a special information coming from Gimnich meeting. They are on time, and it seems that we will have Mrs. Mogherini here at 14:30 as it planned. So please come back from lunch break 14:30 sharp. Thank you very much. Enjoy lunch.